Usually we introduce ourselves, where we're zooming in from, and what we thought about the book. Don't worry if you didn't read the book. Um, I think you'll learn a lot. And so if you didn't read it, you can just let us know, hey, well, I came because of whatever. So I'll start. Name is Reverend Derek Terry. We started this book club in March of 2020 because we were all sitting at home, um, quarantining, trying to figure out what in the world COVID-19 was, and thought, we'd just be at home for a little bit. I love to read and decided I still needed community. Let me suggest some books to read and discussion while we're at home. And you all just wouldn't let me give up the book club. So two and a
Right.
half years later, we're still meeting monthly, and we've read a lot, we've learned a lot, and super excited. So I bought this book like 10 years ago and read it then. No, didn't read it then. Had it on my, if you're a book reader, you have like stacks of books that I'm going to read it, I'm going to read it, I'm going to read it.
Yeah.
Finally got to it a couple years ago, and I was just embarrassed by how much I didn't know about CJ Walker. Growing up, being in the AME church, being in the Black History Bowls, she was always just a name, Black female millionaire, and this hair products. And what I thought I knew about her was wrong after reading the book. She didn't invent the straightening comb. She wasn't, the relaxer queen. And so I just learned so much. Listen to the audiobook that the author reads. It was amazing. So I'm on like my fourth version, my fourth time with all this information as a history buff. I've marked it all up and looked up names and things, and it's just super awesome. So I want to introduce the author, Miss A'Lelia Bundles, who's the great granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, then we'll have everyone else introduce themselves.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. Reverend Derek was telling me about the book club and that you guys are serious readers. So that you are my kind of book club. And I will also say I'm in a book club with 11 other women. And sometimes we have read the book and sometimes we haven't, or so we don't kick anybody out, but we just have a good time. We have food and drink and read and gossip and talk about the world events. So that's what our book club is. But I have a Madam Walker Google alert. So whenever Madam Walker, whenever there's an article or something, I hear about it. So I actually got a Google alert about this book club meeting like a week before Reverend Derek reached out to me. So I actually already knew about it and had signed up to attend. So I was just going to sit in. So this is really great to be here. And if you've, read the book and seen the little bio on the back, I'm Madam Walker's great granddaughter. My mother was vice president of the Walker Company when I was growing up. So that was how I was introduced to the story, but I wasn't focused on it, even though the silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram. And I knew my mother went to work there every day. We didn't sit around the dinner table talking about her life. But when I got to graduate school at Columbia in journalism, and I was thrashing around for topics as students do, my advisor, Phil Garland, who I talk about in the prologue, but Phil was the only Black woman on the faculty. She recognized my name, A'Lelia, and I was not talking about this, but she said, well, your name is A'Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker? And I said, well, yeah, that's my family. And she said, that's what you're going to write your paper on. And so that was the fall of 1975. And it's, turned into now a decades long passion of mine. So that's how I got here. And now it's 4 books and I'm almost finished with the first really major biography of Madam Walker's daughter. And the Barbie doll came out yesterday, and we have a line of hair care products. So there's, it's been fun. I'll just say one other thing. It was really important for me to have my own career and life separate from just being Madam Walker's daughter. So I did that as a journalist. I had a, enjoyable fulfilling career, but now it's just fun for me to tell the story.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for being here with us. And I'm so excited that we get to talk to you right after the Barbie came out. That's just, this is a pretty big deal, And so we'll give everybody else a chance to introduce themselves. Again, you can tell us where you're Zooming from and what you, one word or two words that you thought about the book. And I'll start with Meg.
Hi, my name is Meg Brook, and I'm a longtime member of the book club. I live just a few miles from Rev Derek, so I'm in Cincinnati. About the book, if it's real brief, what I liked was that it was the life and times. It was so interesting to always have her in context with everybody else and everything that was happening. It said more about her because of the enormous amount of research she presented. That was what I liked the most.
Absolutely. Thank you. Lynette?
I'm Lynette Dean, and sorry, I was late. I was having trouble getting hooked in. I am a member of Reverend Derek's church and have been a book club member for quite a while. I live in a little burg of Cincinnati called Finneytown. The book, so detailed. And I would have, I think I said at church on Sunday that Madam Walker should have been president. She was such, she had such a way of getting people to get to think together rather than be at odds with each other. I agree with Meg. The times part of it was so detailed, and I learned so much about that time in history. So thank you.
Awesome. And if anyone doesn't want me to call you out, no pressure. Just let me know in the chat, or let us all know, or you can send me a chat directly. You don't have to say anything. And if I call your name and you don't want to speak, we'll wait a couple of awkward seconds and then we'll move on. I promise you. Joyce?
Hi, my name is Joyce Smith, and I live just north of Cincinnati. As far as what I got out of this book, the word I would use was amazing, just amazing from so many aspects. I feel like I've learned so much history, and Derek, I think this is a book I would want to read over and over and over because it's just so much information from so many different aspects. So thank you.
Awesome. Dixie?
Yeah, my name's Dixie Beer, and I live in Gulf Manor, which is a little part of Cincinnati, very close to where Reverend Terry's church is. And my word would be amazing. I'm about 60% of the way through it because Derek may remember that last month book club I had just tested positive for COVID, and I couldn't concentrate on anything when I had COVID. So I got a late start on it because I'd start and then I couldn't remember anything I had read or heard. So I'm about 60% of the way through, but because I'm only 60% of the way through, I made sure to watch the Netflix, limited series about it so that I was, a little more knowledgeable about the rest of the 40%.
Awesome.
I loved it.
Awesome. Elizabeth, then Julian, and then Karen.
Let me start my video too. So I only got, so I'm Elizabeth Fryer, and I'm from Franklin, Ohio, which is exit 32 off I-75. So there was so much information. I really found it interesting, but I myself am too busy. Like I had to put it away. So I stopped, I think, after the after the pictures. I got a little bit beyond the pictures is how far I read. And then I was like, this is interesting, but it's taking me away from things I need to do. So I didn't get all the way through it, but yeah, I watched the series, the Netflix series a couple years ago, I think. So not maybe, and I didn't get all the way through it, but I think I will do that again. So, okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Julian, and then Karen.
Yes, my name is Julian Collins. I'm here in Cincinnati, Ohio. I started the book. I did not finish it, but one of the things is I remembered writing about Madam C.J. Walker as my first book report in school. That's the one I first remember.
Wow.
Always have had a affinity, and so just even getting started with the book, it was really inspiring just to hear and learn more. And my Barbie doll comes tomorrow, so I'm excited.
Excited about that. And Karen Jackson.
Good evening. Can you guys hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I have to admit, I've had some family challenges, had some death in my family, so I have not gotten through the book, but um, I am a fan, and so I wanted to definitely still plug in, and I'm really excited actually because like our previous speaker, I also had to do a book report, and so and so and I will say also, um, as a African American woman, I also really appreciate the fact that now we can still use the products and so and I'm in the natural state as well, even though I'm not on camera today. I'm sorry, I'm on my cell phone, but I am really excited to just, be a part of this conversation and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, I think the discussion, don't feel guilty or don't feel bad if you didn't read the book. I think the discussion will be really helpful. So the first thing, several of us who have read the book, we've talked about it. The first question we wanted to ask Miss A'Lelia, it's really hard for me to not call Black women who are older than me Miss. It's just like to call them by their first name.
Derek, you know what? And I love that. And I always say to people, because I'm a woman of a certain age, I always say to my young friends who just really can't get comfortable that if Miss A'Lelia makes you feel better, then fine, but we will have no Miss Bundles.
No. It's so funny because like my mother, I have friends who are like my mother's age, who I grew up, they were my mother's friends, and now we're kind of like contemporaries and on boards and stuff, and I still call them Miss So-and-so, Miss So, because I was. But the first question we wanted to ask A'Lelia is, how long did it take? How long did it take to write the book, and what did that look like?
So, while it took me a long time to write that book, it seems like it's taking me even longer to write the one on A'Lelia Walker. But the timeline is, I wrote my first report really about A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance when I was in high school in 1970. But that was, a high school report. And then when I was in graduate school, 1975, I finished the paper that I wrote for my master's in 1976. And then I had to go to work because I didn't have a trust fund because the fortune was not there. But why on holidays and weekends, before the internet, I would go to libraries and do microfilm of old newspapers, because that's where it was things weren't digitized. And so I was adding to this pile of information. And then in 1982-ish, Alex Haley approached us and said he wanted to do a mini series and write a, sort of a fictionalized version of it. And I said, well, we had dinner and he said he was going to hire researchers. And I said, well, Mr. Haley, I wrote my master's paper on Madam Walker. And I have all these letters that we have, these business records. So I'd be happy to do the research. So I did the research for a project that he was supposed to do that he never did. But I wrote a young adult book that came out in 91. That was really the first biography of Madam Walker. Amazingly, that there had not been a book about her. And then it took me another decade, it sort of working in between, work and other things to finish On Her Own Ground. So that's 1975, 1991, 2001. So but I would say I left, I was at NBC at that point, and I left NBC, let's see, so 2001. So like early, mid 2000, and I just like nose to the grindstone for about 9 months, and I finished it in that period of time, but I had been gathering material all along.
So it was just the amount of research, like the amount of research, and you being a journalist, it made sense to me why the story was packed with so much information, but really like accessible, if that makes sense. Like it read very intelligently, but it didn't read like it was inaccessible to just regular people. And I really appreciated that. And I just kept thinking, how did she find this? How did she know this?
Well, listen, here, I love that you said accessible instead of excessive. Because I think my end notes are kind of obsessive compulsive, but I felt this, I'm sort of in between these two worlds of being a journalist and wanting to tell a story that is readable and interesting, but also owing a great deal to my friends who are scholars and who are historians. And I wanted it to be credible to the people who write history and who document things. And I also wanted it to be readable. So that it was sort of striking that balance. And it really was a lot of research. I mean, I'm fortunate that I had, as you said, you went down the rabbit hole at the Indiana Historical Society, because Madam Walker, one of the smart things Madam Walker did was to hire people who kept her records. And so we now have 40,000 documents, and they've now been digitized. But that was the corpus of my research. But then, because for the first 38 years of her life, she really was, not a famous person, not a lettered person, not an educated person. So that's why I had to fill in all that history. But there were breadcrumbs from everything from city directories at the Missouri Historical Society, where I could tell where she lived and where her brothers lived, the courthouse in Delta, Louisiana. The folks there were so kind to me, and the clerk of the court opened up the little courthouse on a late rainy night and climbed up to the top of the stairs and pulled the ledgers down. I was really lucky that those ledgers existed, because this was in the middle of the South during the Civil War, when records in many courthouses were burned, but
Right.
somehow that clerk of that court had buried those ledgers and they still existed. I had met the family who had owned her parents and the plantation where she was born. And then the other part is that because she knew so many famous people, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, that their papers are scattered in different places. So all of those things, plus the Black newspapers, really helped me be able to recreate her life when I didn't have documents to say where she really was at the time.
There was one more thing, and I'll open it up for other questions. I think we share the same birthday.
June 7th?
Yes. So when I saw that in the prologue, I think, I said, my twin, right?
Hey. Well, and I was concerned, you all are in Cincinnati. My best friend from childhood and I were born on the same day in 1952, and she lives in Cincinnati. We grew up in Indianapolis, but I was in Cincinnati a few weeks ago because her daughter got married there.
Oh, wow. Look at that.
But she's my she's my real same day, same year twin, but I'm happy to share a birthday with you.
Oh, that's awesome.
And
Awesome.
Prince
Yeah, I was just about to say it, Prince.
and
which is-
Gwendolyn Brooks.
I'm about to say, we got some dope people on June 7th. Definitely, definitely. So anyone, questions, comments, thoughts, Lynette?
Let me get unmuted here. So there was, in preparation for the book club meeting, I watched the miniseries, and it was after I read the book. And throughout the miniseries, it's like, well, that wasn't in the book. Was that true? There was like, there was a lot of, there seemed to be a lot of artistic license that happened in the miniseries. Is that true, or am I misguided?
No, you are right on the money. Artistic license is the polite euphemistic way. So I think, Reverend Derek, I think I shared with you, there's an article that I wrote, and maybe he can share it with all of you, about my experience with the Netflix series. So I was, when I was still writing the book, there was interest in doing the film, but the whole Hollywood thing is, when something gets made, it's like a miracle, because a lot of projects get started and they never make it to the screen. So I had a couple of bites early on, and then there was just, nothing that was happening. And then I was approached, it's a few years ago, by 4 different production companies. And I went with the one because the producer seemed to really appreciate the research I'd done and seemed to really value what I was doing. But once he made, once I'd done the deal with him, given him the rights to the book, and he made the deal with Netflix and Warner Brothers, they hired a writer who I think wasn't that experienced, and 2 showrunners, and they were all, I was hoping for Hidden Figures, and I think I got more Real Housewives of Atlanta. So they, my low bar when I went into this, I'm thinking, oh, they're going to really they're going to do this story about women empowering each other and Madam Walker building a business. And yes, Hollywood has to use artistic creative license, and you've got to conflate characters, and that's things that didn't really happen. They have to put in to tell the story, but I was counting on them to stay true, at least to the core of the person, and not put in stupid boxing matches. And so my low bar was, I didn't have script approval, but I did have script review. And so that meant they had to show me the scripts. And so again, my low bar was, please don't send something that will make me cringe. But when I got the first script, they had Madam Walker and Annie Malone physically fighting each other.
Oh, no.
And they had them calling each other the B word and the N word. And I said, this is not Real Housewives of Atlanta. And it's not that women from the beginning of time didn't know how to throw shade and didn't think something equivalent to that. But that's not how those 2 women interacted. And Annie Malone was a successful businesswoman. They were rivals, but Annie Malone wasn't a drug addict, and skin color wasn't the source of their conflict with each other. A'Lelia Walker did not have a girlfriend named Esther. And I'm just going to tell you one other 2 things. Mr. Ransom was a straight arrow who had taken a pledge at a young age to never drink, smoke, or curse. And they introduced this made-up character who was not just a numbers runner, but a pimp. So I'm like, how much more stereotypical can you get? So that I didn't like. And then with A'Lelia Walker, they wanted to have a LGBTQ theme, which was fine with me. And if she'd had a girlfriend, I would have been cool with that. But they were sort of sneaky about it and they wouldn't talk to me directly. And they sent me a script, the showrunners, and they sent me a script where they had inserted her girlfriend as a entertainer named Bricktop, who was a famous blues singer who'd been to Paris, well known. And they, and so then when they sent me the script, I read it and I said, I met Bricktop in the 1980s when she was performing at Fiorello's in Lincoln Center in New York. And when I was introduced to her, she told me that she and A'Lelia Walker did not like each other. So you have just dropped this person in. You don't think anybody's going to know, and people are stupid. So they changed the character. So it was that kind of thing where they just really, they were like, oh, well, A'Lelia, it's not a documentary. So we're going to do the things that we know how to do. So but let me not be entirely negative. Let me say these positive things. I thought Octavia Spencer was great.
Amazing.
When she, and I was so happy. That was what made me so excited. When she came on the screen, I just, she knew what was going on. She knew that there was some conflict because they wouldn't let me come to the set. And a week before they were finished filming, she called me and she said, we should have you come. And I said, well, if I'm invited, I'll come, because they really had told me I couldn't come. So she was very nice. Blair Underwood was lovely. He had reached out to me early on because he wanted to do more research. He's become a friend. So there were some positives. I thought the hair was great because a lot of times Black women's hair in Hollywood movies looks horrible. It's not well done. So the good news is a lot more people know her name. People were entertained, and some people now read the book. So
yeah. And her basic story was there. Her basic story was there, even though there was and it was more, yeah.
Right.
It was
so
good.
Anyway, you got it. Yes, artistic license. But Octavia was great, and she got to have Blair as a love interest.
That's I appreciate you saying all of that, honestly, because the historian in me, having read the book and then watched the docuseries, the fighting was weird to me. The boxing thing, I thought that was weird. Even, the colorism thing, I thought that was that was weird. Yeah. And I love, like, I felt like reading the book, there was enough real drama that if people had cared for that intellectual, they could have pulled out some of that. I mean, the shade at the church when Madam Walker offers her companion to play the piano for Annie Malone, and she's like, no. And and everyone, I could see the Black church and the people whispering like, oh my, like I saw that shade. But right. That was, sophisticated, smart, successful women. That's how they do. It's very polite.
As my mother used to say, nice, nasty.
Exactly, nice, nasty. And even some of the political and social stuff, like near the end of her life, I thought that was fascinating. That it blew my mind, because again, you think of her as this making all this money and wearing the furs and having the cars and the diamonds and the houses, but to see that she was literally taking her money and as fast as she's making it, trying to figure out how can I help my people, and sometimes linking up with the wrong people in the process and what that does. And so I just thought all that was fascinating, and she deserves many movies and documentaries.
Well, and we're working on some other things, when I can talk about them, I will. But yeah, there's just, and I think that I think in the right hands, these stories can be told. But I think that the stories, especially stories of women and people of color, Hollywood has not told those stories well. It's told them in cliches. That series about Gloria Steinem and Phyllis Schlafly and
Mrs. America.
Yeah. That the people who really know that story, they thought the same thing, it was just so easy to fall into it. It's a cat fight between two women. When there's, yes, these women have different views of the world, but you elevate it a little bit and you can still be entertaining.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Elizabeth?
Sure. So what interested me was like the fact that Booker T. Washington would not recognize her success and her like, how frustrating was that? And so since I'm sorry I didn't finish the book.
Don't worry.
Did he ever?
Yes. So there's a real arc. There's a really interesting arc, which I think, you know, is a story that needs
I
to be
said
told.
that's a
And
story.
Elizabeth,
Yeah.
I will say to you, I have trouble reading books right now because I'm trying to write a book. So I listen to a lot of Audible. So if you, you know, and you do it when I'm pulling weeds in the garden,
Yeah.
when I'm in the shower, when I'm running errands. So that's how I just finished a 900-page biography of Elaine Locke, but I would never have been able to sit down and read that. It took me, you know, several weeks. So anyway, hopefully maybe you'll read the Audible. But the book.
Before you get started, let me say, Derek's already said this, but like biographies are not my thing. But this one was very, it was readable, but like you, I'm writing a book as well. So
there you go.
So yeah.
And the other thing I will say to you right before you get to the pictures, that's the Pittsburgh section. And I, as a writer, think that's my least well done part of the book, because I had a lot of numbers and, you know, it's like one of those things you go back and go, oh, you know, I should have, that was a little dense. So
I thought it was very, very readable. I thought the whole thing was very readable. I really did.
Thanks.
For a biography, yeah.
So the Booker T. Washington, I mean, it is, and one of the things with reading the Elaine Locke story, it's like any other, you know, any other community, there's a lot of subtext with people who aren't really getting along, or who are, you know, on one part of the political spectrum and undermining other people. So Booker T. Washington was so powerful. He was manipulating so much, and she was not part of his inner circle. So some of it has to do with that. She was not an educated woman, even though she was self-educated and had, you know, risen to the occasion. But his wife and some of the other women who were part of the National Association of Colored Women, they had gone to Oberlin, they had studied in Europe, and, you know, and they were, you know, more sophisticated in a way than she was. And he really did have a real objection to these hair straighteners and skin lighteners. And he knew that in fact, that because the Black community was so vulnerable to those beauty products, you know, that some of the Black newspapers relied heavily on them for revenue. And he really objected to that. So, but she knew that even though she didn't agree with him on all his politics, that because he was so powerful, she wanted the recognition from him. And she'd written to him asking him for her support. He ignored her. She had other friends try to intervene. He ignored them. She actually attended his 1910 convention in New York, but, you know, was very low key. But by 1912, she had made this contribution, this $1,000 contribution to the Black YMCA. So she's like, well, you know, now, you know, how you like me now? You know, I'm a player. And when she arrived at that convention, she wasn't on the program. And, you know, with any conference, you've already decided who your speakers are and you've picked everybody months in advance. And she was going to push her way to the front, and she had other people stand up on her behalf, and he was having none of it. But when she finally stood up and spoke, she made such an impression that even though he tried to, you know, move on, she had taken things over. She had, as Madeleine Albright said, sometimes women have to interrupt, and she had done that. So ultimately, when he came around, and she visited Tuskegee, she made small contributions. When he invited her back the next year to be a keynote speaker, he knew that she was on the rise and he could no longer ignore her. So by the time he died in 1915, there was a mutual respect between the two. And through the next two generations, with A'Lelia Walker and with my grandmother, there was a relationship between the families. And, you know, and I am friendly with some of his descendants now, and you know, and I was as upset for them, you know, as they were with the way he was portrayed. Now, Booker T. Washington is a complicated person. And Madam Walker was much more radical than he was, but she appreciated and I will just say this, the thing that I found interesting about her is that in the Black community during that period of time, people who were in leadership roles or heads of colleges or whatever, people felt they had to they had to either be in the Booker T. Washington camp or the W.E.B. Du Bois NAACP camp. And she didn't have to choose because she was making her own money. Other people sort of needed him for patronage or support. And so that I liked that about her, that she could say, there are things about Washington that I like, and there are things about Du Bois that I like. And I'm just doing things that I think are going to be good for Black people. I'm glad you asked that question, because for me, that makes the story more interesting, that they start out, you know, on a bad foot, and then they find a way to, you know, to work together.
What was so interesting to me was why, I mean, she had proven her worth, and she gave $1,000 to the YMCA, and I mean, and other corporations gave like $250 or whatever. And that why was he so resistant?
Because she was stepping outside of her lane.
As
being an uppity woman.
As a woman. Okay.
Even though his wife was a strong person. She was president of the National Association of Colored Women, but Madam Walker was not part of his inner circle. And so she needed to wait for his permission. That was, but you're absolutely right. She was being an uppity woman, and he was not having that.
Yeah.
I love that she showed up on his front porch. I mean, you know, there's a song that the Temptations and the Supremes used to sing, "I'm Gonna Make You Love Me." It just, it's just with her, like, I just love that, because she's like, this is what I need. He doesn't know it, but Tuskegee needs could benefit from me, and I'm just on her own ground. I'm just going to figure out how to make this work. Meg, that's your hand.
Yeah, I think that's why, Lynette, why you thought she should have been president, because it was really her attitude that made it possible for her to not be in one camp or the other. Because most of us would have said, well, if he's not going to recognize me after all I've done, I'm in this other camp. And instead, she stayed true to her actual values, which is, it's not about me, it's not about my ego, although she had a big enough one to do what she needed to do, thank God. But she didn't let her ego get in the way of the work. And the work was to do good for the people of my race. And she, even though it was not reciprocated in the beginning, she had enormous respect for what Booker T. Washington was doing for people. And she would have never taken that away from him. So it was like, like Derek says, I'm gonna respect you, I'm gonna love you, but you gotta love me. So that character in her is just such a rare quality in a person, especially someone who's so successful, because someone so successful starts thinking it really is all about them. And she had, like I said, enough of that to continue working at this incredible pace that she did. But she never lost track of, this is for my workers. This is for people so that they have enough money to educate their children and to not have to be domestics. This is for everybody in the community. This is good for all of us. This is good. In a way, I shifted my view also from this was about silly beauty products, which Booker T. Washington might have thought, even if he had been disabused that it was about straighteners and skin color, it still could have been seen as, what's just cosmetics, who cares? That she was a public health worker. And that's what I learned from the book, is that people were really damaging their bodies, that, they had illnesses of the scalp. And she was like, oh no, here's basic public health, hygiene that y'all haven't had access to and you haven't been taught. And we're going to have people going door to door and through all these social groups saying this is about your health. So I was really impressed.
Well, listen, you just gave me chills, and I am loving this conversation because I wrote down she was a public health worker. I love it when somebody sees something that I haven't identified or haven't put a name to. So I so appreciate your careful reading of that. And you're absolutely right. And I will tell you, my interest in Madam Walker, because when, growing up, when other people thought she invented the hot comb, and I was like, and that it was just about beauty products, that wasn't enough to interest me. It was when I began to discover that she'd employed thousands of people, that she had a political dimension, these other things, that's when I began to think she's really worth paying attention to. So, and I will say, when you said the public health worker, I am so using that, Meg. I am writing your name next to this quote, and I am going to quote you when I do this. But my good friend Tyrone McKinley Freeman, who is a professor of philanthropy at Indiana University School of Philanthropy, I met Tyrone a decade or so ago when he was just starting to work on his dissertation on philanthropy in the Black community. And he has written an amazing book called Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving, that really drills down on her philanthropy. And he just won a $300,000 history prize for that.
Nice.
But what he did, where I gave the sort of the big, picture, the overview and the initial research, he drilled down on Madam Walker as an educator and as a person who was taking Booker T. Washington's idea of industrial education, where he said people needed to stay in the South and cast down your buckets where you are. And he reinterpreted that she was updating that to people moving to urban areas and women needing to be able to support themselves. So now you and Tyrone have both given me a new dimension. So thank you.
Joyce, your hand up.
Yes, I was wondering if you could speak to, I was so impressed when she was just starting out, women of the community and church.
Joyce, you got mute. You got when I'm
Oh,
mute.
sorry.
All right.
Her relationships with the women in the church it seemed to me, were such a linchpin. It was like they were mentoring her, and she just took it all in and went from there. But that was really so touching to me, their spirit.
You really honed in on it. And I mean, that is for me, the piece that I really always want to emphasize, and what for me, I just could not, persuade the Netflix folks how important this was. But it was those women of the church who made such a difference for her. And it was, she'd been to church in Delta, Louisiana, her family minister, but it was moving to the city with the AME Church has, as you may know, just a long tradition of educating people, of providing that safety net, and those middle-class women of the church and the missionary society, and in sorry, my phone is ringing, but in the missionary society and in the choir, that she was the washerwoman, but she had a good enough voice that she could be in the choir. Even if her clothes were not fancy, she could still sing. And those women embraced her and made sure her daughter went to kindergarten. And gave her, I think, a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. She took it way beyond anything that they imagined or that she could imagine. But without those pivotal relationships, her life would not have become what it did. So you're absolutely right. That was so key.
That was something we talked. I used Madam Walker's life as the introduction to Sunday sermon to prepare for this. And growing up in the AME church, I'm like, I stand on the shoulders of all those people in church who looked out for me, who invested, who asked questions, who, how's school, how's this? And it was just like the church was the hub of the community, especially you're talking late 19th century, early 20th century, where the Black community was so cut off from white society and white companies. And just to see her coming to church for warmth and seeing the beauty in the church and knowing that her child, is getting what she needs. And then seeing the example of people at a higher station in life or society than she is, and that longing towards something and trying to make a family and find the husband to that could help get there. It just reminded me of so many women that I know their names, that I've seen that. And I think that's why she related to Booker T. Washington so well. Complicated is the perfect word. You read Up From Slavery, and I would always think if I was around in 1912, I would be a W.E. Du Bois follower, right? But then you read his Up From Slavery and see how he was able to navigate slavery to become this college president. And you have to acknowledge, maybe I would go a different way, but there's something there that he had, and that he was using that position to do what he thought was the right thing for the race. And that was
Right. I mean, he was an institution builder. There's
Exactly.
no college that W.E.B. Du Bois founded, even though Du Bois is kind of my intellectual hero. But
Exactly.
he was able to, and because of his relationship with Julius Rosenwald, there were hundreds of Rosenwald schools. So yeah, he was a force. And so Reverend Derek, I would just ask you, because you grew up in the AME church, I just imagine her as this, poor washerwoman, but sitting in the pews where the leadership of the AME church versus the Baptist church in the Black community they were more educated. There was more structure. It was also international with missionaries. So there was looking beyond your immediate community. So I'm just wondering if that's something that you thought about as you were reading.
Absolutely. Because I grew up looking at the Missionary Society in church raise pennies for Africa. And so we called it Pennies for Africa. And it went back 100 plus years, right? Where women at that time were literally collecting pennies every Sunday. And it was a competition, right? Healthy competition to see which church could raise the most. And they would send that to the AME churches in Africa to support the mission work. So when Madam Walker is raising money to help, and before she became rich, helping, raising money for a family who's struggling with this, or even giving the YMCA the $1,000. It's like at that time, I think her receipts were like $12,000 or $13,000 a year. So when you think about it, and she said in her letter, I'm not at the same level of wealth as all these other people are. But it's that whole, when you see it, like when you're in the church and you see the Madam Walkers, like you see the people who stand up and tell how when they came here, they couldn't afford this, their hair was falling out, but the church rallied around me. And now that I have to give, like to give one approximate tithe, like to pledge a tithe to a organization was a huge deal, because there were people who made 10 times what she was making that were giving a fourth of what. But I think the difference is her seeing that and experiencing that and knowing that this actually makes a difference. Like me giving this money, her paying nickels to kids to run errands, going to the row houses behind the Walker factory to give food. Like I've seen that. I've seen people come in church, and the women in church, the missionary societies rally around them. I remember one year we gave out food baskets. Every year we would give out food for Thanksgiving. And I'm not talking about like a little basket. I mean like boxes that, you know, with turkey and ham and canned goods. I mean, this will last weeks. And I seen people like they would do a drawing, like we would have 15 of them, but everybody would come in, we'd feed, you know, 100, couple hundred people, and then they would do a drawing for who's going to win these baskets because we had more people in need, and people would be like crying. And when I'm younger, I'm like, it's just food, because there's never been a food issue in my house. And the missionary president, she said, it's not just food. This is her, she's feeding her family. Like, you see how the kid, like, and so just seeing Madam Walker's persistence in giving, you know, making sure that the women made a more than fair wage. Like, because I thought about that. I said, just think of what the company would have been if she was exploitive. You know, the capitalism of the time, of our time, would be make all that you can, pay your workers as little as you can. And that's just not who she was. And I feel like for Black companies and for Black individuals who have money, we sometimes feel that pressure of, I have it, so I need to help my mom, I need to help my people, I need to help. And sometimes I read a book on it as a small business owner, that sometimes that's why our businesses don't go, you know, too many generations into the future, because sometimes we're really trying to catch up. We're really trying to help others. And so I just, being in the church, being from Louisville, being, you know, used to be AME, we talk about as a club that a lot of us are in, it was really powerful, really powerful.
Huge difference. So Joyce, thank you for asking about that, because the church was key, very, very key. And every time she moved, she joined the AME church in Denver, right, in Indianapolis, in New York.
And the infrastructure is there. That's the beauty of, and you can, and it was interesting how she went from needing the church's resources to then being a part of the church's, you know, missionary work, and then to filtering some of her own philanthropic efforts through the church, knowing that they had the infrastructure to get it to where it needed to be.
Right. Exactly.
So that was powerful. Anyone else? I have a list of questions if people don't.
Oh, I have something else just to say. I appreciated that you included so much about her relationship to men, because you could decide to just kind of leave out the personal stuff, but isn't that part of our work as women today, to figure out, like, yeah, how do we get our intimacy needs met, and how do we treat our children, and how do the children turn out, and how does that, what effect does that have on the work we're doing, and vice versa? And I especially came out with this great admiration for Miss.
Uh-oh, you went to mute, Meg. Great affirmation
for Mr. Ransom, who unlike all of the husbands and partners, he just couldn't have been more loyal, more calm, more, I mean, it appears more steady, committed to her values. But again, this whole issue of egoism, it's like he was like the backup person that everyone absolutely needed to be there. He could speak up for himself, but he didn't need any and apparently any ego satisfaction out of it. He was doing it also for the good of these values, and probably for his great love and respect for these folks who were working so hard. So good on Mr. Ransom.
Yeah, he's you know, yes, and he's so pivotal. And in the book that I'm writing about A'Lelia Walker, we get another decade of him trying to keep her in check. But he is, you know, and she called him her general manager. You know, now he's the general counsel, CFO, CIO, CTO, you know, head of HR. I mean, he played all of those roles. And I think one of the reasons that I think Madam Walker is more remembered than than Annie Malone, because, you know, there's still a posthumous competition with some folks between them. But it's because he was such a meticulous record keeper, and he was her attorney, and her secretary kept things. So I mean, that's why we have 40,000 documents. And she chose him carefully. She got rid of the bad husband, and where Annie Malone's husband, you know, when you know more about her husband, Aaron Malone, really was you know, just kind of terrorized her, you know, mentally abused and undermined her with her agents and threatened to sue her. And then she had another employee. She had promised to include him before she married Aaron Malone. She had promised to include him on the profits. She reneged on that, and he sued her, and it was like a 2 decades long lawsuit. But Madam Walker had jettisoned the husband and had ransom in place. So he was really critical.
Absolutely. Lynette, did you have your hand up?
This is a personal question, and you don't have to answer it. But as a relative of C.J. Walker, and having the legacy of your namesake, what was it like around Thanksgiving table? What was it like around Christmas table? Were there stories about the family? You know, I'm just curious.
You know, it's a great question, and I would say my mother was really wise, because this was my mother's family. My dad's family they were not people of means, but my dad was a real hard worker and hustler, and he was. But when I was growing up, the company that he was president of was also a Black hair care company, and it really was the more financially successful company of the two. But the Walker legacy loomed large in the community's imagination. But my mother had, in a much more, segregated era. She was born in 1928, child of the Depression, but more privileged than, many other African Americans. And she had been, everybody knew that she was Madam Walker's great-granddaughter. So she went to boarding school. She went to a Black boarding school in North Carolina. She went to Howard University, and she had a fur coat. She was very, very smart. She was a really good student, but everybody knew who she was. She majored in chemistry and business at Howard because she was expected to go into the business. When she was a freshman at Howard, her mother had become president of the company. Her mother died when she was a freshman at Howard, and she was named president of the company. Now she was, 18 years old, but that was sort of the succession. And then more long story, but my grandfather sued the company because Mr. Ransom, bless his heart, at that point was trying to disinherit the next generation, even though I'm good friends with his grandchildren, but that was kind of a blip. And then my mother's family sort of won the lawsuit, and my mother came back. By then his daughter was the official president, though my mother was the one in the office every day. But there's that drama that would give you some perspective that she did not want me to have to feel that same pressure. And I would just say one thing, years later, I was in DC visiting a friend, and I was in a taxi on my way to the airport, and the taxi driver and I started talking, and he said he had gone to Howard. And I said, oh, my mother was at Howard, class of 49. And he said, well, what was her name? And I said, A'Lelia Perry. He said, oh, we would see her walk across campus and go, money, money, money. So she did not want me to have to, carry that. And so that was always, it was that I was interested in writing, and she encouraged me to do that. And, yes, we had the silverware that had belonged to Madam Walker. And, yes, the baby grand piano in the living room had been A'Lelia Walker's. And there was monogrammed linen and fancy china, but it was mostly in the, in the attic. So I did not feel that pressure. The only pressure that I had was be a good student and do, and accomplish something. But it's a great question. And I didn't have a trust fund, so there.
How was it doing the research and just like, I know when I find something that I've never learned before about any subject that excites me, I get excited. How is it when it's like your great grandmother or your great grandma? Like, how is it when it's your family? How was that process? And was there anything
Well,
that stands out that
There's
like
so
really-
many discoveries. When Meg was saying that I was truthful about the men. And as you know from the prologue, when my mom was actually, this is the last conversation I had with her before she died. And I said, so what do I do about, these divorces and the this and the that? And she said, tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth. And that's a very different message than a lot of people get from parents and grandparents. So and as a journalist, I'm about truth telling. Now, sometimes you may pull a punch here or there, or you put something in perspective, but I always, my sort of mantra to myself is that I wanted her to have, I didn't want to hide her flaws, because I thought that if she appeared to be perfect to people, they could not aspire to have their own dreams. And so I was, I told the truth. And she tried to bury the information about the second husband. She never she did not mention that. And it from the book, she never divorced him, and it came back to bite her. It came back to bite the estate after she died. So there were those, those kinds of stories. But it was important to me to find the flaws and to try to present them in a measured way, to try to really be honest about the conflict with Annie Malone. But over time, I also felt this, a great pride that she had overcome so many obstacles and that she had done so much for her community. Ultimately, it became, for me, the hair care products and the business, while it was important that she did that. And for me, that became a means to an end to empower women and to help them become economically independent. So it was, being a family member, and I'll say this sometimes, when I talk about the Netflix series and what I don't like, and people say, well, it's your family, doesn't that bother you? It was like, well, yeah, I guess on some level, but what bothered me more is that the community was just kind of, not given this generation that one generation out of slavery who created institutions and colleges, and then the other people, the Booker T. Washington and Annie Malone and these other people were not given their due. That bothered me as much as the fact that it was my family.
I love that. I think that's one of the reasons why we're looking at Ida B. Wells and like what was going on. I felt like that part of American history, that from Reconstruction to World War II, for Black people, we usually hear about lynching and all these terrible things that we should definitely discuss. But like you said, like the institutions and churches and colleges and all these things that we were figuring out how in the middle of the terror of lynching and World War, and how we were able to figure out a life and create in the midst of that. And that's really inspiring.
Yeah, that's really important. And I will say, because I'm glad you all are reading Ida B. Wells next. I was texting with her great granddaughter, Michelle Duster, right before we got on. Michelle and I are good buddies. And, she had the Barbie doll, the Ida B. Wells Barbie doll a few months ago. And she's saying, girl, you're blowing up on social media. And I actually mentioned her in all the media interviews that I did, because I knew about the Madam Walker doll, but I couldn't talk about it. And when the Ida B. Wells doll came out, so I knew what was in store.
Love that. Love.
Oh, and I would just say, with the institution building, part of what I certainly didn't learn that history in high school. My high school history well, I got a great public school education in Indianapolis. Black history and women's history was not, not part of it. And I wasn't interested in history. I probably should have majored in history in college, but there was nothing saying to me, oh, come over here. But it was my grandfather who planted some seeds for me, because he had saved, all of his family papers, in addition to that was my grandmother, my mother's mother, who was the Walker family. But her father came from a really interesting family. His grandfather had been, his grandfather's mother had been an enslaved person who won her freedom through a lawsuit. Her father was white, and she was to be freed when he died. And so then her son became a free person. He lived in Memphis, and then he moved to Arkansas after the Civil War, and he was elected to the state legislature and was superintendent of prisons during Reconstruction. So my grandfather's description of Reconstruction was very different from the scallywags and the carpetbaggers of my high school history textbooks. And his grandfather had sent his children to Oberlin, to the high school part, after he was sort of pushed out politically in Arkansas. So they went to Oberlin, and his father had been working on, picking cotton on a plantation in Arkansas, but ended up going to a Quaker school for Black children called Southland. And then he went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania and was valedictorian of his class in the 1880s. And then my grandfather and his brother went to Lincoln, and my uncle went to Lincoln. So in his mind, this is what, the institution building that was happening. So I grew up knowing that it would, even though it wasn't something that other people were talking about, but that gave me sort of a foundation to approach this storytelling.
I love that. One of the other things that interested me is the relationship between Lelia then, because she didn't change her name until after Madam passed, and her mother. So how was that? Like all those letters from each two ransoms.
Isn't that amazing?
So how was that?
Well, and that is, as I say in the book, their secretary, Violet Reynolds, who was my neighbor and who was still working at the Walker Company in the 1970s when she was in her 80s. And she was one of my key sources. And she was, she sort of looked askance at A'Lelia, because A'Lelia was in New York having a good time, and they're toiling away at the factory in Indianapolis. And they saw her as a party girl. But when I said, well, what was their relationship like? And this is before I'd read the letters. And she was a tall woman, and she sort of lifted herself up and she said, fire and ice. Fire and ice. They loved each other dearly, and they sometimes fought fiercely. I mean, and that was like 30 years ago or more when she said that to me, and I can still hear that. So you can imagine she's the one who's first opening the letters before Mr. Ransom reads them. And she's seeing, she's reading this conflict. And I will say, I have very few letters between Madam and A'Lelia. Mm-hmm. So what I was able to do was sort of triangulate, because they were writing about each other to Mr. Ransom. So that's how I was able to tell this story. But and you'll see in the new book, it's complicated, because, what I'm have reconstructed for this new book and trying to see it through her lens. They're very poor. Madam marries this guy, John Davis, who abuses her, probably, is certainly mean to A'Lelia. She's living in that turmoil and seeing her mother being treated badly and not being able to get away. Ultimately, she gets the courage to leave that bad situation. But her daughter has seen all of that, where other people now see her as this strong, heroic woman. She's seen her mother at her worst. But I think it's their relationship is forged because they have that knowledge of each other. And then, Madam is sacrificed because she wants her daughter's life to be better. And their daughter's like, but I'm not you. I know you're doing all this, but it's like any child. I can't be what you want me to be. And so that's why by the time after Madam Walker's death, I mean, she's sort of still involved in the company, but she tries to break away and create her own interests, which is why she becomes very involved in the cultural activities of the Harlem Renaissance. That's her way of expressing herself. And at the same time, it is consistent with their relationship, because part of their bonding together as adults is they both love music and theater and art. So she's still enmeshed, and it is a dysfunctional relationship.
Yeah, I saw so many of my friends whose parents have money, or whose parents have, they've seen their parents go through things, and sometimes their parents feel guilty that, that they were there. And I saw so many of those things. And the Harlem Renaissance, I cannot wait to read this.
I can't wait to finish so you can read.
I cannot wait. Did anyone have anything else? Because if not, we can.
This is Elizabeth. I have, is it Ransom as the attorney?
Yes.
Mhm.
I'm just curious, like he was pretty young, right? When he came to work with her.
Right. He's closer in age to her daughter.
So how did she find him? I mean, like wasn't he really young? Like,
well, no, he was in, so he was in his, 30-ish.
Early 30s, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought he was.
But he at that point read law and was, had a law practice. So, but there are a couple of different stories that his family tells, and that he in various interviews tells, and there's sort of two different tracks. One is that he was working as like a Pullman porter or a red cap, and because she traveled so much, she ran into him, and he was in law school, and she apparently was impressed enough that she said, when you finish law school, let me know. Then there's another version of the story that he came to Indianapolis. He had had his shingle out as a lawyer, and he roomed in her house because she, when she rented a house, she had roomers to help pay the rent. And he started doing some work for her, and ultimately she persuaded him to to come to work for her full time. But he had either in law school, she had met him when he was still in law school and said, come work for me, or he was already starting to work as a lawyer and he was doing a little work for her, and she saw that he could be helpful and that he was loyal and skilled.
Okay.
And he was near in age to Lelia, right?
Yes.
A few years older.
Right. But he was the deadly do-right.
Right. And I also think I felt like I know you because I've listened to the audiobook twice. So, I've listened to you read for 16 hours.
Oh my God. You
twice.
are a nice man.
Right. So your voice just sounds really familiar now. So I just remember he being a few years older, but very, very much more mature. And it seems like they both needed him. They like the company needed, but just their personal relationship. And that's why the pimp in the Netflix special was a little weird that, he would, not necessary, but I really like Ransom a lot.
Yeah, he is a lynch. Somebody earlier said a linchpin, and he is definitely that. And even clearer, I mean, I've just finished writing about so the Lelia Walker and her Dark Tower. This was in the townhouse, and all of the artists and musicians and writers came. And it really was this kind of visionary concept where there would be members, patrons who would pay a fee, and then that would mean that the young writers who couldn't afford a meal could come, and they had a place to be. And so it was a it's like the McDowell Colony now, or Yaddo or something like that. I mean, kind of on that kind of vision. But he thought, this is a bit frivolous. He was trying to build a new building in Indianapolis, and Amelia was off pretending she wasn't spending money and hiring, expensive decorators. Though that is ultimately her legacy. She did know what she was doing. But the chapter I just finished writing, she was starting to have some health issues, and her husband lived in another place. And so she left New York for about 5 months after the Dark Tower opened, and it was, very popular. People loved being there. But the woman she put in place as the acting manager or hostess was embezzling money. And when she got back, the bills weren't paid and the electricity was being ready to be cut off. And Amelia had become too friendly with this person to discipline her. And so the letter that I have is she's writing to Mr. Ranson saying, I need you to come this week, not next week, because I need you to tell her this, this, and this. And, she knew what needed to be said, but just as she had done with her mother, she avoided confrontation. And so he had to come and, right. And of course, the woman avoided him. So there's this long letter where he's telling her, you have not only stolen money for which you can be arrested, but you have betrayed her trust. So I'm so glad they left these letters.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Something else that interests me was the way that she used media, the way that she used the Black newspapers. Like she would be an influencer, like these beauty influencers of 20, like her Instagram would have millions of followers. And so I really appreciated that. And I know the research involved with that wasn't just typing in Madam C.J. Walker into a database. I know that
Not when I wrote this book. This was microfilm.
I know you were looking at microfilm.
This was
really
sleeping on somebody's couch for the few days.
Meg?
I just want to add that that's why I appreciated this book so much, because if you read, I'm a white person reading Black history, and I'm going to know about Booker T. Washington versus W.E. Du Bois. I'm going to read them and I'm going to have access to that. But I don't have the experience of sitting at a table saying, but what did Grandpa do? Or what did I don't have the, and even though in a setting like our church, which is informal and where we get to know a lot about each other's families, we might meet them, for instance, over time, more than once. It is still hard for me to individualize Black history. That it wasn't forces of this versus forces of that. And especially as a female writer writing about a female where the domestic life is going to be part of the story, because she was a wife and she was a mom as well as a business person. It's not going to be a sideline. Oh, well, he was also a father. No, this was an intense part of her life, and for her church, for that matter, because that can also be very female. What it did for me was it really created a sense of this is one individual family overlapping with a whole bunch of other individual families with personalities who were in conflict and who loved each other and who hated each other and tried to work it out, just like the family,
everybody,
the family I'm in.
Right.
Because you wonder, what difference did it make? Because as I said at the beginning, you read Black history and it's like, oh my God, people must have just been terrified all the time of being lynched. So yes, there is a background of fear and anger and commitment to uplift and such, but it's going to play out in daily life. How do you look good? What do you eat? Where do you go on Sunday morning? And it really brought history alive for me, and I appreciate it very much. I need it, and I hope you write some more, and I hope other people take it as an example of how to write history.
Thank you. Well, and that's why it's so, what's scary for me right now is this kind of lid that's being put on the teaching of history. That, when you want to say, okay, so these were the things that were problematic, but that means telling the whole story of how people were resilient and how they survived. You're right. Nobody wants to say, every single moment that people were awake, they were afraid they were being lynched. It was what were people's families like? And that sort of normalizing of people's lives is what is what we need, that we need to know people are human beings. I remember one of the things that when I was a producer at NBC and ABC, at that, it was just sort of, the news was much better then, but the way that people's views were, like if I went to cover a hurricane or a tornado and the aftermath or a flood, that the cameraman and the producers and correspondents, it was like all of the families who were, affected were white. And so it's like you would never see like a Black family, but there were Black families too. And so you didn't get that sense of humanity, or you just had what we call B-roll, that's the general footage of family watching television. There was never the Asian family watching television. It was always the white. So it was like, we need to see everybody as part of this, this human story.
That's why I said at church on Sunday that I lift up Madam Walker, not because she was rich. I lift her up because she wasn't supposed to be rich. She was born a couple of years out of slavery. She was born extremely poor, and she, on her own ground, took the life that God had given her and did something that she wasn't supposed to do. And the whole time was trying to pull and lift as she climbed, and everything that she did, even wearing the furs and taking the pictures. It wasn't just a look at me. It was, you can lift yourself up out of where you are. And that is just so powerful. It's just so powerful to me. And I think that's something that when you have been on the margins, a part of those oppressed, marginalized groups, you have that in you that other people don't necessarily have. That sense of obligation to help other people. And I look at Black philanthropy since her day. Like, you look at someone like a Oprah Winfrey and how she gives and how she builds, and listening to her wanting to start the school in Africa. First thing I thought was, Oprah did that 20 years ago. Like, look at how that, and we see what happens when you start that school. I mean, those girls are now being educated all over the country, all over the world, and they're making a huge difference. And we have to say, Madam Walker's legacy paid the down payment on that type of work, and it's just powerful.
Well, you all have just been such a blessing to me. When next time I'm in Cincinnati, hopefully on a Sunday, I would really love to sit down and
definitely
have dinner. It's been really I'm being honest, it's been one of the best conversations I've ever had. It's an intimate group and great questions and wonderful thoughts. So I'm super appreciative. I will send Reverend Derek a couple of links for you. There's a documentary, $2 and a Dream, that some of you may have seen, but it was done in 1989 by Stanley Nelson, who is the grandson of F.B. Ransom. And Stanley is now a famous documentary filmmaker, who also did more recently Boss, the History of Black Business, where there's a little Madam Walker segment. But the 1989 $2 and a Dream was his very first film, when he was, struggling to raise $50 to buy a can of film. And he now looks back and says, oh, I would have done things differently. But it really is a loving portrayal. And my grandfather's in it, and some of the ladies who worked for the company are in it. So it gives you,
It's
a
really
view
good.
onto that, those people born in the late 1800s and just what they thought about being a Walker Company employee.
I see it's on YouTube, right?
It is on, you can watch the whole thing on YouTube.
I've watched that, and it was really cool to see the faces of some of the people in the book. I did put the date, and it's 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Crusade for Justice, the autobiography of Ida B. Wells. Our friend Dr. Holly McGee, who we've seen several times, she does a whole thing on Ida B. Wells, and so she'll be joining us. Thank you so much, A'Lelia.
What date is that?
The 29th of September.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is so rich, and I'm just so grateful that you gave us 90 minutes of your time, that you could have been
Absolutely.
writing that book. So just thank you.
Thank
This
you.
has been awesome. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Everyone have an awesome day. Take care and God bless.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Ready.
much.
Bye bye. Thank you.